Hello, everybody. This is Fred Stoeker, and this is my podcast discussing sexual addictions and recovery from sexual addictions. Today, I'd like to talk to you about masturbation, and I'd like to talk to you about what the Bible has to say about masturbation in our lives as Christian men. I was on a Zoom call the other night, and I was talking to a church group, a men's group at a large church out in California. And it was about 35-minute teaching, and then there was about 35 minutes of Q&A. And the very first question, which is often the first question when I'm out teaching, was this: who do you think you are? The Bible doesn't even mention masturbation, so how can you say it's wrong? Clearly, God is okay with it, or he would have said something about it in the Bible. Well, the Bible doesn't have to say something is specifically wrong in order for it to be wrong. I mean, God hasn't listed every last thing that's wrong in the Bible. The Apostle Paul in Romans 14 admits that. So the first thing is that's kind of a strange argument, all right? But there's a couple of other points I would like to make. That argument is actually intellectually dishonest from the get-go. And the reason is simple. Most men have never even read through the Bible even one time in their lives. So how can they say to me, the Bible doesn't say anything about masturbation? Clearly, they are parroting something else they've heard somewhere along the way, something they like because it allows them to keep the practice going in their lives. So, first of all, again, dishonest. Second thing is it's intellectually lazy to say this, okay? And let me give you another example so that you can see just kind of how lazy it is. Let's say that I get a brand new neighbor next door, and they have a dog, and this dog barks constantly. Okay. Keeps me awake at night, keeps my kids awake at night. Every time I'm out doing yard work, it's barking at me. It's just driving me straight out of my mind. Let's say I go to the neighbor and I explain my concerns, and the neighbor basically says, you know, basically, I don't care how you feel. Uh, this is my dog. I love this dog. We've had him for years. We've moved here, and this is just how he is. Okay. So I look at it and I say, okay, this dog's not going to change. The neighbor's not going to change the situation. So I grab a hunk of T-bone and I poison it and toss it over the fence. Problem solved. You say to me, that's horrible. That's so evil. You're evil. But I say, who do you think you are? The Bible doesn't even mention poisoning dogs next door. Okay, so how can you say it's wrong? Clearly, God's okay with it, or he would have mentioned it in the Bible. Okay, you see how absurd that is? In the same way, it's absurd to say that just because God doesn't mention masturbation, that he must approve of it. I mean, that's just not true. The Bible does indeed talk about masturbation, though. It doesn't use the word masturbation. It doesn't directly say it. However, the Bible has a wide range of Bible verses that are kind of catch-all verses that allows us to uh, find out whether something is good or bad or right or wrong. And so it kind of gives us a filter. These verses help us filter things that aren't specifically mentioned in the Bible. And I want to go through just four of those today that I think relate to this. And here are four catch-all verses. Okay, number one is 1 Corinthians 6:12. And I'm just going to give you a paraphrase of what it's talking about in those verses. You can go look them up if you'd like, okay? But the question there that God is asking, or that in this case through the Apostle Paul, was this: is this action beneficial or helpful? Okay, so if it's not beneficial or helpful, you shouldn't do it. All right. If it is beneficial or helpful, then you can. You see how this filters things that aren't specifically talked about. and helps us to see right and wrong, even when it's not specifically spoken about. How about this? 1 Corinthians 10:23. Does it edify and build you up spiritually? How about this one? 1 Corinthians 6:12 again. Is it enslaving to you? Does it lock you into patterns that keep you from freedom in Christ? And how about this one? 1 Corinthians 8:13. Does it hinder the spiritual growth of a brother or sister in Christ? According to the Apostle Paul, if it does, you shouldn't take part in that action. All right. Now, I want to just spend a few moments applying these 4 scriptures to this concept of masturbation, because I believe through these 4 scriptures, God is indirectly speaking to masturbation and saying, this is not a good practice for my sons and daughters. All right. So let's go to the first one. Is it beneficial and helpful? Well, masturbation isn't beneficial to us spiritually. And one of the reasons I know this is that I've been in this ministry for right now 23 years. And I have thousands upon thousands of emails from people, men and women, that say to me, when I quit my masturbation, everything changed. My intimacy with God improved. It just exploded. Okay. And what I hear from people that haven't gotten rid of it is I just feel like there's this distance between me and God. I can't seem to break through. So one of the things I see is that if people want to be closer to God than they've ever been before, one of the first things that they need to get rid of course, is masturbation. Now, let's go to the second one. Does it edify or build you up? Well, actually, masturbation tears down our natural sexual focus. Our natural sexual focus is other-centered, all right? You'll find if you go through the Bible, sex is never spoken of one single time out of the context of 2. Sex is never talked about in the context of 1, having sex with yourself. It's always spoken of in the context of 2, always spoken of in the context of men and women. And except when it's literally saying homosexuality is wrong or something like that. And so what we have here is the natural state of a man's sexuality and a woman's sexuality is to be other-centered, to be looking for the pleasure of the other person. Now, what scientific studies confirm is that masturbation twists our sexual focus inward while erasing our more normal and natural concern for our partner's pleasure and mutual connection. Our personal sexual intensity, meaning the intensity of what we're feeling, becomes a lot more important to us than the intimacy that we're feeling together. Okay, that does not edify your relationship, and it certainly doesn't edify you as a human being. Okay, so obviously, when the Bible is speaking indirectly about masturbation, we know this to be so, and this is a negative. Number 3, is it enslaving? Modern science asserts that the addictive nature of orgasmic pleasure is clearly enslaving. The more we do it, the stronger the neural pathways are in place that make us want to do it again and more often. Okay, and once that's in place, obviously, you're enslaved. Since we depend upon this false intimacy that we get from masturbation to help us feel better, to help medicate our wounds and those sorts of things, we then can't even sometimes feel like we can live without it. There was a guy here just a few weeks ago that I was talking to, and he said that he knows of this guy who his wife said, look, you've either got to quit the porn and masturbation or I'm leaving. And he literally said to her, I cannot live without my porn and masturbation, but I can live without you. So you'll need to divorce me. And is that enslaving? Yeah, he's enslaved. and he's moving in directions away from God, away from family, away from the purposes of God in his life. Time for a break. One of my greatest pleasures in life is traveling to churches and speaking to men and helping them get free. If you would like to have me come speak at your church or your men's group, you can get a hold of me at fredstoeker.com. I want to just talk to you heart to heart a little bit about what it was like back when I was living in those days. Okay, so I had really worked hard on my sexual purity, and I had really worked to really control my eyes and to make sure that I wasn't looking at things like porn. I wasn't looking at the girl in the string bikini or the babe with the too tight halter top flowing out all over. I mean, I was getting all of that out of my life. And I thought that once I did that, I would be pure, I would be free. We're talking about being enslaved here, right? And I was completely enslaved through my eyes. And I thought that once I had that broken, I would be free. Trouble was, it seemed like I was only about, if I could pick a percentage, maybe 85% of the way pure. And I still found that I still had this masturbation habit. And as I began to really look into my life and to try to figure out what in the world is causing this, I'm not looking at the wrong things. I'm not, you know, trying to get jolly somewhere in an R-rated movie. I'm just living my life, keeping my eyes clean, keeping my eyes straight ahead, okay? And yet, this other habit kept on. As I began to look at my life, I began to realize that what was happening was most of this masturbation was happening late at night in my office, actually this very office I'm sitting in, okay? And the thing about it is that um, I was in full commission sales, which means if you don't sell something, your kids don't eat. That was a lot of pressure for a young man, especially a young man whose dad always berated him. And I never really felt like a man. My dad never said, "Hey, you're a man, step up here into the world of men with me and you can stand shoulder to shoulder with me." Nah, my dad kind of thought I was a wuss. And so I already had doubts in my mind anyway. And so now I'm in this full commission sales. I'm struggling. Um, Most of my paperwork I had to do at night because during the day I had to be out in front of people trying to sell stuff and feed my family. So, but I would find that as I began to look at myself, I began to see that um, I guess the nights that I would fail and I would masturbate were the nights where I felt the highest financial pressure. All right, where I just felt like my world's about to collapse. All right. Um, the second thing that I found was on the nights where I was really doubting my manhood the most, that's when I would masturbate. And as I began to think about it and really study what was going on, it occurred to me something for the first time in my life. It occurred to me that not all sexual sin is sexual at its root. Okay, so there are non-sexual things that can drive sexual sin. Okay, and what that also means is I can use my sexual apparatus to medicate the pain I'm feeling that is not sexual at all. So if I have financial stress, I can medicate that with sexual apparatus. If I have manhood wounds, father wounds, I can medicate that with my sexual apparatus because masturbation and orgasms release reward transmitter chemicals like dopamine and other chemistry that medicates the pain. And the trouble is with that, of course, is those things are addictive. And so here's what happens over time. Um, those, masturbation became my go-to way to deal with any of the major issues in my life. That's enslavement. And the other thing about it is it also doesn't edify. Because let me tell you how I dealt with it. Financial stress. The only way to deal with that, obviously, besides making a ton of money, was to turn that financial stress over to God in prayer. And so, whereas what I was doing before was that um, I was taking the matters into my own hands with lotions and a towel, okay, masturbating, or I could turn to God. And what I began to do is I began to turn to God with that financial stress. Now that I knew that non-sexual issues like financial stress can drive the masturbation, now I knew what was going on. So I could literally choose, instead of masturbation, I could choose prayer. And it wasn't very long before this began to break. The same thing was true of manhood. I turn to God in prayer, but I also turn to God in one-on-one worship. Uh, Worship where I'm singing out loud to him, just worship songs, just him and me. I'm in my office, he's up in heaven. And the thing is I found that it grew my intimacy substantially with him. And once I had stronger intimacy with God, guess what? I didn't need the false intimacy that comes from masturbation, that feeling of intimacy that we get from that chemistry. I was able to have genuine intimacy with God himself. And I found that that desire to masturbate when I was feeling my father wounds disappeared because I could take those to the Lord in intimacy. All right. Well, so guess what? Masturbation is then the opposite of edification and building me up. What is edification and building me up? Turning to the Lord with my financial stress, turning to the Lord in worship. That's what edifies. And so if we stay with our masturbation, if we stay with that habit, it will inhibit our ability to get closer to God. And it will inhibit our ability to be edified and to grow as a man. I think about those days, okay? And I think about who I am today. Okay, so back then, I mean, you heard what went on. Today, I have been an intercession leader in my church for about 25 years. I'm not just one of the intercessors, I'm the leader. I'm the one where the pastor has said, you are the man, you are responsible. Okay. Well, when he first gave me that responsibility, kind of a funny thing happened. I really didn't know much about intercession when I took over, but I had had so much growth in my life after I got the sexual sin out of my life that it was just, it seemed like a natural step to step into that at the time. Oh, my word. Intercession teams are made up mostly of women and honestly, very emotional women. And they have trouble sometimes discerning between the spirit and their own emotions. And so I'm just kind of an old linebacker guy, you know, and so I'm trying to lead 20 women. And one day I got so frustrated, I went to the Lord and said, why did you give me this job? I'm no good. I have no idea how to deal with this. I have no idea how to deal with these women, and I don't know anything about intercession. Why would you give me this job? And the interesting thing was, he did not answer that question directly. He gave me an answer, though, and it was a better answer than what I was asking for. This is what he said to me. He said, if you had not gotten your sexual life in order and your sexual sin out of your life, I could not have given you this great responsibility. Okay. Um, there you go. When we dump the masturbation, okay, the Bible doesn't say masturbation's fine, but it does indirectly talk about how it breaks down the edification, it breaks down the sanctification in our life, it enslaves us. So when you get rid of it, you can move from being the Fred that was in his office masturbating at night because he was scared to death to becoming an intercession leader that can basically deal with the spiritual pressures of an intercession group. Because why? All of the emotions, all of the stuff that goes on in an intercession group sets you up to fall into sexual sin. You can very quickly get into an emotional relationship with a woman before you even know it. God knew that wouldn't happen to me because of what I had done to get my life in order. You see, In order to be a true man of God, sometimes we have to listen to the indirect things God is saying in the Bible so that we can, again, match up with who Christ is and match up with who we're supposed to be as sons of God. Now, by dumping the masturbation, I've confirmed and matured in my faith and edified my entire family in the process. Today, it's hard to even imagine me turning to a drug like masturbation instead of turning to the Lord when I have a stress in my life. Okay. What if I had continued in my dependencies? Sure. I could have argued, okay, God never said anything about this, so I'm cool. Well, piece of cake. Anybody can do that. But those other verses confirm this, that my fully developed Christian manhood would have been severely stunted had I not taken the steps I took. My continuing masturbation would not have helped Brenda's spiritual life grow because we're one flesh. If mine's not growing, hers isn't really growing, at least not like it could. And my continuing masturbation would not have helped the spiritual growth of my children, who I taught each of the four how to defend themselves from sexual sin. Well, I had to first learn how to do it myself before I could teach them. And let me tell you something. When your son at age 21 comes to you and he says, I was in a men's retreat and 21 of us were sitting around and the leader said, how many of you are struggling with your sexuality? 20 of them raised their hands. My son didn't have to. All right. And when that kind of thing begins to happen, all right, you know things are going in the direction that God specifically says indirectly that you need to go. The habit would have hindered all of us spiritually, but it didn't because I stabbed it through the heart. Now, okay, it's time for a break. I want to bring your attention to my book, Battle On, Battle Over. It's written by Brenda and I to help wives and husbands work together towards sexual purity. Tells a lot of the stories I'm sharing today, but also many others. And we want you to be blessed. The other thing is this. God states his will for you when it comes to your sexual purity. I'm just going to read it. It's in First Thessalonians 4, 3 through 5. I've got it memorized, but I'm going to read it just because I don't want to miss a word. It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should, listen, learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust like the pagans who do not know God. All right. You need to learn to control your own body. Masturbation makes it very unlikely that you'll ever learn to control your own body. That's a flat out truth. And if you want to follow God's will for your life, which is to learn to control your body, you need to just accept the fact that that needs to be dumped out of your life. All right. So I have talked about this masturbation issue from the biblical standpoint, talked about the indirect ways God speaks towards the issue. Now I want to talk about it from a human sexuality perspective. Guys will say, I just use masturbation from time to time as a relief from stress. Okay. How can that possibly harm anyone? Okay. Well, I my first thing is this. Okay, what in the world? Is this the only way that you can think of to relax? Okay, whatever happened to a round of golf? Whatever happened to, I don't know, putting hummus around your plants out in the backyard? I mean, anything. I mean, a bike ride, fishing, whatever it might be. So my first thing is, why in the world is this the big deal? And what it often feels like to me is men are clawing back parts of their sexuality and saying, God, you can have the rest of my sexuality, but this part I'm keeping because I need it to relax. Okay. Now, the second thing is the original biblical argument that was made at the beginning of this podcast is now working against you, because the Bible never, ever, ever says that God's sons and daughters should use their sexuality as some kind of a relaxation device, that they should use their genitals as their, I don't know, their massager. Okay. It's just never, it's never said. And if it's never said, uh, how can you be sure what in the world you should or shouldn't do with it? Okay. And what I want to tell you is what the Bible actually says about sexuality, and human sexuality, because it gives us a really good picture as to whether or not we should consider using our sexuality as some kind of a relaxation technique that we just do on our own in the corner of our house, and then we just move on with our day. All right. This is what 1 Corinthians 7:2-5 says. But because of sexual immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise, the wife also to her husband. Now listen closely to this next verse, verse 4. The wife does not have complete authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband also does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. All right. This is a very critical verse in the Bible. And I think that it really helps to clarify a lot of things when it comes to our sexuality. Number one is we do not have our sexuality. My sexuality was not given to me for me. A lot of times we think of our sexuality as ours. It isn't. Okay, even when you're 16, okay, when my son was 16, turns out when he was 23, he married Rose. Even at the age of 16, his sexuality was not just his, it was being protected for Rose. Okay, because Rose, from the age of 23 to 80 or whenever she dies, okay, that's, I mean, Jason's sexuality is hers, not just his. And so, and the same thing is true with me. My sexuality is Brenda's, and Brenda's sexuality is mine. Now, she grew up always knowing her sexuality would be her husband's, and she protected it that way. I did not. I damaged mine. All right. And once I get married, especially, I have no right to do that. And so when we're thinking about our sexuality properly from the perspective of God and how he designed it, I mean, he just flat out said here, nobody owns their own sexuality. It's not yours. It's been given to you as a couple. All right. Once you know that, now let me ask you a question. Do you have a right to choose to relax in your bedroom masturbating without asking your wife for permission? No. Now, if you ask your wife for permission, she says, yeah, go for it. That still doesn't mean it's right. Okay, we've already talked about the other things. But the fact of the matter is, you can't choose to have sex with yourself without asking your wife first. And if that hits you between the eyes, good, because that's the way God sees things. And the thing is, the Bible does clearly say that his ways are higher than our ways. And this is one of those ways. Most of us are thinking like the world thinks. Oh, this is my sexuality. I don't use it unless I really feel hot and I really want to. And if my husband needs my body, but I don't want to do it, tough. Okay, that's not how God sees things. He sees things, this is your sexuality is a mutual thing, and it needs to be protected that way. And you need to begin to see it as something that you don't have full say over. Now, I'm not saying you can go to your wife and say, okay, woman, your body is my body and I get to do whatever I want to it. Then you're obviously kind of an idiot. But the thing is, um, there is a very basic kernel of truth here that needs to be respected by both genders. Now, the Bible also, I mentioned it earlier, the second point I want to make is that the Bible only speaks about human sexuality in the context of two. Clearly, God designed your sexuality not just for you, but for both, okay? But primarily for your wife, actually, not primarily for you. Sex is a joint ministry with your wife, okay? You have a joint ministry to each other. Human sexuality was created so you could connect with your spouse, not given to you so you could have sex with yourself to relax on a Saturday afternoon while she's out shopping for groceries. Okay. And here's the other thing about it. I mean, your wife deserves to have your sexuality as hers in the sense that when you, okay, if you Saturday afternoon decide to have sex with yourself, but she wants to connect with you physically, Saturday night, and you've already kind of had all your fun in the afternoon, you're cheating her. You're robbing her from what is rightfully hers. And you don't have a right to do that. And until we begin to look at things this way, there's just no way we can live sexual lives that are holy and that are fulfilling each other in the way that God originally created it. Now, number three, I want to talk about this masturbation from the standpoint of God's perspective, because we love to say, oh, God, he could never ask us to withhold our use of our sexuality before we're married. In this day and age, we don't get married till we're in our 30s. It would be cruel and unusual punishment for us to have to sit here and never use our sexuality until we're in our 30s. That's certainly not what God intended. And of course, back in the Israel days, they were all getting married when they're 14. And somehow we like to use these arguments to somehow create this case that determines our view of what God thinks. Well, you know what? God thinks what he thinks. He doesn't need our help to understand what he thinks. And he doesn't need us to try to figure out what's fair, unfair. Okay, that's been our problem from the very beginning, from the Garden of Eden on down to now. So, but let's talk about it anyway. And I want to talk to you about a young man named Alex that I met. It was actually over in a little retreat center just west of Ames, which is where Iowa State University is, and that's where he was going to school at the time. And I was talking about, I was teaching the young men in college, how to be sexually pure and what they need to do and all that. And I saw him standing around. He was waiting till everyone else was gone after I was done. And, people were coming up and thanking me. They were asking me questions, whatever, and then they were leaving. And finally, it's just him and me and Alex. And Alex said, God would never have made me sexual without also giving me a way to use that sexuality and to release the pressures that come with it. He said that would be unfair. And he said to me, there has to be something I'm missing, Fred. There has to be a way of using my sexuality in an approved way that God could approve. And I just don't know what it is. Can you tell me? And the real issue with Alex is that he could not conceive of the fact that we could actually be sexually pure. He felt like there had to be a way that God had given us that was not sinful, but that would release things, okay? And I will tell you that that's always a failed path. You have to understand that God's ways are higher than our ways. And he might actually just ask us to be pure for 20 years. Okay. And from his perspective, it makes perfect sense. From our perspective, we're sitting there screaming it's unfair and can't possibly be true. There's no way on the planet, though, that we can know what God would ask or wouldn't ask of us because his ways are so much higher than ours. So the only way that we can deal with this is to deal with it straight up. Alex was making the same mistake Eve made in the Garden of Eden. She thought God was hiding something good, okay, and that if she would eat that apple, she would literally have that extra knowledge that Satan said she could have. All right. And so she couldn't believe that God would withhold that from her on one level. She was also thinking God's unfair. Uh, why don't I get to know these things that God knows? I mean, that's essentially the temptation. And that's what Alex was making that same mistake. God was being unfair. He's hiding something good from me. And so it ratchets down and cycles down through the ages, doesn't it? About that time, because Jason was about Alex's age, I asked Jason, he's my firstborn son. I asked him about this. I told him about my conversation with Alex, and I said, son, how do you look at this? This whole idea about being made sexual, but then being asked to not use it. And he said, my son is pretty basic. He's just a basic computer engineer. He's not all flowery, okay? This is what he said. I figured that if God asked us to be sexually pure, there must be a way to accomplish it. My job is to find that way and accomplish it. Okay? Now look at the difference between those two. The one was asked by God, I've made you sexual, but I'm asking you not to use it. And his response was, that can't be so. When he asked Jason the same question, Jason said, oh, okay, help me find the way. I'm in. And you see the difference. I can tell you this, after 23 years of ministry, the ones who think in this way, like Jason, that look, I just need to shoulder my weapons and get the job done. I I don't really understand God's ways, but that doesn't matter. If he says I can learn to control my body, evidently I can. So I'm going to give it my best shot. Okay, that's one way. And that's the guys who think like that win. The guys that think like Alex, they never win. They stay stuck and they're as frustrated as can be, both with themselves and with God. Certainly not edifying, is it? Certainly not something that draws you closer to the king, to have that attitude. So what I'm saying is, in conclusion, is this. Masturbation is not spoken of directly in the Bible, but it is spoken to indirectly by many verses, uh, having to do with edification, enslaving, whether or not your brothers and sisters around you are growing, all these things, okay? The second thing is that, you know, human sexuality is built for two, not for one. And masturbation does not fit the pattern. Um, sure, mutual masturbation does when you and your wife are in bed and pleasuring each other, that's fine. Okay, but just sitting off in your corner and having sex with yourself, that does not fit the biblical pattern. And if the biblical pattern matters to you, which it should, uh, that has to mean something. And then number three, um, masturbation, we can look at it and we can go, well, God can't possibly mean that we should not masturbate. Um, you cannot understand God's perspective on these things. You can't. His ways are higher than your ways. What you need to understand is there's not a Bible verse anywhere in the Bible that's any more clear than First Thessalonians 4, 3 through 5. It literally says, this is God's will for you to learn to control your body. is there anything more clear? Well, then, if he says we can, then let's do. And I can tell you, I know guys are afraid of losing something that they don't want to lose. They want control of their sexuality. They want control of, excuse me, they want control of using their sexuality. But um, there are greater things than that. Um, Dumping all that, allowing yourself to have your spirit matured and your weapons matured in Christ, and to be able to teach these things then to your children so that they can carry on basically you know, their floor is your ceiling, and they're going to start at a place much higher than you did. Instead of starting life after college with 4 girlfriends, sleeping with 3 of them like me. You know, my son started when just right after college. He married a girl and had his first kiss at the wedding altar. That's a huge difference in a single generation that can happen. But it doesn't happen if you don't obey. When we obey God, it frees him to pour blessings out on us like crazy, because we are fitting the pattern of the cosmos that he set up. Are you willing to obey, even if it doesn't clearly say masturbation is wrong? Uh, if you will obey, you will bring blessings into your home, to your wife, into your family that you could never have seen otherwise. And that's the truth. God bless you.